This is Big Man Tyrone, and you're about to watch the MtG Cabal Cast with your hosts, Woad, Thirsty, and Reptar. Sub to us on all your podcast networks at MtG Cabal Cast and YouTube.
All right, guys, welcome to the newest episode of the Cabal Cast. This week we have part one of another two-parter for you. Somewhat inspired by one James Chilcott in his tweet, which has since been lost to the ether of the internet, where he said, I guess we're in the portion of the reserve list spike where we just buy everything out. So what we started doing was taking a look at the reserve list spike of 2018, comparing it to what spiked here in 2020, and what conclusions we've come to.
Yeah.
So basic rundown here, we're going to get into what happened in 2018, similar to our history of the reserve list talk. Start with the origins, when this first happened, what led to it, give some examples of stuff that happened back then, and some parallels to today. And then next week, we'll have even more information on a separate part of what we're referring to as the annual reserve list summer.
Yep. So 2018 was an interesting year, and it basically started out with a giant spike in cryptocurrency. And so what we have here is actually the price trend for Bitcoin in particular, which spiked in December to about $15,000 per coin, and you can see crashed immediately afterwards as everybody exits the market, holds for about 7 to 9K, and then, we are where we are right now. It hit sawtooths for a little bit. So that money went all over the place. And it's not hard to kind of track back the fact that BTC affected the magic market, because a lot of people were very vocal about what they were doing.
Yeah.
In 2018, it took a little while to happen, but in the summer, shortly after the release of Dominaria, is when we saw our largest spike in the reserve list that year. And we saw it across a number of cards for a number of different reasons, and across certain versions and not others. Reported back from that year, a lot of things happened around GP Vegas. There is a Reddit thread that is also a million miles down about a person that cashed out of Bitcoin earlier in the year and then went and attempted to buy, and I don't know if they were 100% successful or if they just didn't buy as many as they wanted to, alpha, beta, and unlimited duels. And this person was very forthcoming with what they were doing. And there are a number of similar threads on Reddit. But that didn't just put pressure on iconic cards on the reserve list, it put pressure on the entire reserve list. And so we saw in 2018 what we're seeing now, but to a much lesser extent. So we have that immediate driver. And so if we want to take a look at things, the first thing we want to look at is actually something like Underground Sea. So Underground Sea is a very iconic card. One of the original duels. It's played in a number of formats. EDH, Legacy, Vintage, Old School. It sees a bump in 2018, right after Dominaria. It troughs, it drops, and then it's on the upswing right now. So this is a card that was spiked kind of appropriately, and
yeah,
it's going to hold and it's going to go up. This is a piece of, iconic magic paraphernalia, essentially.
And it's very playable, and it's very liquid because of how widespread its use is. Something we've been harping on for a while now, especially, is one of the formats that's continually firing is EDH.
Yes.
You want your dual lands for EDH, there you go.
Yep. And because of how liquid it is, that makes it a pretty safe place to park money. Something that is still liquid, but not nearly as sought after, and we found quite interesting, was something like an Unlimited Lotus. Unlimited Lotus didn't actually spike as one would have expected during this time. It did eventually crest past $10,000 in, I think, in early 2019, as we can see in the graph. But when you look at 2018, it just kind of hovers around 6.5. And we see this trough in the price chart because it just emptied from TCG Player. It's not up there. This is not a card that's really going to go up there. So when it spikes back up, that's it being relisted. And so we see it kind of be solid. What we actually saw instead happen with Lotus was the Beta Lotus. Beta Lotus actually just disappears from the market entirely, and when it comes back in 2019, it triples in price. So this is a card that kind of spiked outside of that market. It was moving on Facebook. It was moving through Discord. It was moving basically in ways where you can look at it and assure yourself that you're getting what you're paying that much for.
Yeah.
And we talked about this much earlier on in the cast, where beta is the kind of player set compared to alpha being the collector set. But there's just not a lot of alpha lodi out there. And if people are looking to park money or cash out, they're going to take not what they can, but something that's collectible and kind of still liquid. And a beta lotus is liquid. Not necessarily as liquid as an unlimited due to the price point, but it is slabbable in almost any condition, and that's going to add a premium.
It's also liquid to a different group of people. The thing that's worth noting when you're selling an unlimited lotus compared to like a beta lotus. When you're selling an unlimited lotus, you're selling to a mass market. You're selling to people that need power for vintage, people that collect whatever. Once you get to the price point of a beta lotus, you're selling to a legitimate collector who's going to be respectful of your time and respectful of their own, generally speaking. So they're going to be like, look, can I see this beta lotus? Great, cool. In that case, it looks good. Here's the deal.
Yes.
Done. It's someone who's going to get that card and sit on it. They're looking at it more as an investment, whereas with an unlimited lotus, you do have those people. But primarily, it's going to be people that want it to play with or want to own power or something like that.
Yeah. You see more people rolling down from beta to an unlimited now than unlimited up to beta, and a lot of that has to do with price and stopping. And they're done with the collection, but they still want to own power.
Yeah.
There are people that do roll up. Andrea Mengucci posted a couple of weeks ago. I think either he just finished his beta set or an alpha set of power and was extremely happy with it. And he's a person that's been rolling up over time because that's what he wants. He wants to be that kind of collector. A lot of people at this point roll back down because they want that cash. They want that liquidity to move somewhere else. Because unless you are just willing to sit on it for a while, let it accrue value, and then sell it off again, you want to recoup something so you can take that money and make it earn for you again.
Yeah.
That's a lot of that value too. And it makes it kind of interesting because it's okay. The unlimited doesn't spike like we expect it to, and that's playable in vintage and old school. Well, then what happens with something like Yawgmoth's Will, which spikes in 2018 as well, dips a little bit, but then comes roaring back up. But the floor was reset at almost 2.5 times what it used to be. So this is another interesting kind of trend that we saw with a lot of these cards in 2018, where this is another iconic card. And that's kind of what happens. A lot of these iconic cards that were a little more liquid because of the price point and easier to move around, people would pick up as they could and shuffle them around as expected. It doesn't take a lot of time to move a lotus, but it's a lot harder to move the needle on a lotus unless a lot of people are moving in on a lotus.
Yeah.
And with the BTC cash out, yeah, a lot of people could have moved into a lotus, but for a lot of people, that opened up other doors to pay off other things before they moved into Magic itself.
Yeah.
So this
and I think on the vendor side, the interesting thing was you started to see vendors pay in Bitcoin, like Abu,
yes,
which I think still does. And when you would go to a booth and they would offer Bitcoin, it was interesting because they would only offer it for lower end items, unless you specifically requested, like, hey, I'm looking to move this lotus, but I only want Bitcoin. Whereas if you just came in with like a 40K collection of like modern staples, they were like, here's your cash. We don't really want to handle that. Yeah. So the Bitcoin cash out, from what I saw, it was people looking to move in to pay other stuff and people who were looking to invest rather than flip. So that's why you saw stuff with power start to trickle up. And I remember anecdotally back then, I bought a lotus from Roland Chang for 3K, and then a couple months later sold it for 5.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, and it creates this kind of interesting paradigm when you look across everything in 2018, because like we said, the Bitcoin cash out, much like what's going on now, did raise the floor on everything across the reserve list. But you have this interesting paradigm where some things held, some things didn't, and some didn't really move at all or as much as you would have expected to for the more forward-facing or liquid versions in something like Power or some of the P3K stuff that went as well as part of a reserve list movement. And it created this run that it wasn't the start of FOMO buying, but you saw a ton of it. we were joking about earlier, like there was opportunity to move into cards like Hatred, which, yes, are EDH cards, but a card like Hatred isn't something that should spike like we saw not too long ago and hold that much, because it does it one thing and it does it beautifully, and that is just kill one person real quick in EDH. You just
Side note,
murk.
when Hatred spiked, one of the guys in the Cabal is in Europe, and I did arbitrage from MKM and bought about 350 copies for $700.
Yeah.
After buy list hit like $20, 15 to 20, I just dumped them all to Channel Fireball and a couple other vendors. So I didn't expect it to stick. I thought, here's a low-hanging reserve list fruit that seems to be pretty EDH playable in one deck and one deck only, and that's Skithrix, which, as you said, is good at shotgunning one person.
Yep.
And here we are. Evidently, that was an instance of, throwback to a prior episode, price correction rather than price manipulation.
Yes. And so we saw an uptick slowly over time with Hatred. I brought up the price graph. You can see it did spike a little bit, and then it just kind of rolls back down towards 14 from 20. And that's a spike that we didn't expect to hold. We didn't expect something like Hatred that, yeah, it was iconic when it was in Standard because it did the exact same thing it does in EDH, but is much more narrow now and kind of behind the scenes compared to a card like Berserk, which didn't see much movement at all, despite the fact that it was a legacy. I don't want to call it a staple, but a highly played card in Legacy until very recently. Yeah. And there, as I was going back to before this, it created this kind of like FOMO wave of buying where people felt it was okay to pay whatever inflated price was being asked on something like Wall of Kelp. Like, sure, Arcades was in Dominaria, and we've referenced these two cards I don't know how many times at this point, so I don't want to bring them up. But a wall that makes more walls and thus drawing you one card a turn is not worth the $15 price tag that was put on it immediately. But people were paying that. And it was this FOMO thing, and it was, okay, well, what can the reserve list really handle? Can it be floated like this forever? Is anything going to stop? What's real? What isn't in 2018? And it took time to figure out.
And it was interesting because there was, we've got a playability spike, we've got a collectible spike, and then another spike we identified from 2018, which again was more of a correction, was something like Yawgmoth's Will. And the interesting thing about Yogg's Will in 2018 is not only did you see a spike from reserve lists, which it took a little bit for Yogg to actually see its price increase to like the $60, $70 range. We leading up into the winter before 2018, it saw a little bit of an increase, and it wasn't until June that it actually stuck. At that same time, you also had an explosion of CEDH. Explosion.
Yeah.
There were more people playing CEDH.
Yeah. And
this is the type of thing that over time we saw was less spike and almost entirely just correction that happened to happen at the same time. And you look at historic numbers of EDH Rec, which you can't find now, unfortunately, and where they're at now, and Yogg Will is a lot more played than it used to be because you have more people getting into the format, and it had a little bit of vintage playability, though Storm hasn't been good in that format since Shops, I guess. Paradox Storm is a different story.
Yeah, there's mentor stuff where you can, whale shenanigans.
But it's interesting to see that. And it's something that I identify as a real spike.
Yeah.
Or a real price correction. And what's the difference, you may be thinking? Well, to me, it's literally playability. You look at a card like Elkin Lair.
Oh,
okay.
Yeah, you had me
that card is an enchant world from Visions. I can't imagine it's good. It's a red enchantment with too much text, which means it should be worth money because casuals. But then you look at the spike. It's back to where it was when the spike happened, which granted a spike to $3. That card's not very playable. And this is one of the subtle things about MTG Finance is you may like the card, you may want to play the card, but that doesn't make it playable. Whereas Yogg's Will was an eminently playable card that we saw spike, because in addition to, EDH explosion, well, we know this reserve list stuff is spiking, so we're going to buy this too and move into it. And that's when you had vendors paying $45, $50 and throwing it in a case for $60, $65 just to get the card in the case and flip it to have it.
Yep, you got to fill holes, and if you know that hole is going to churn, you can pay 70% plus because you're in a position on that weekend to take that 10% that somebody is okay leaving on the table. Yeah.
Yeah, and just
Absolutely.
immediately move.
Yep. So something I looked up real quickly as you were talking about CEDH is that, and this isn't really correlatory, but 1v1 EDH hit on Moto in July of 2018, which did muck a little bit with paper finance because it emulates or emulated CEDH a little bit, and they kind of pulled from one another for a while, where it was like the Brawl deck was the format, and then Flip Nissa was the format, and those kind of ruled the roost and definitely, determined what required a price off the reserve list, because if that format ever comes to paper, people want to be prepared. Or, in the case of something like Tiny Leaders and Oathbreaker, once the information starts getting out that this is a format people are playing it on Moto, the expectation is that, this will be in paper, and these cards now demand a price, so we don't get hoisted. Or we can get out in front of this and just sell into FOMO and let anybody who hasn't repriced eat it on the back end, kind of thing. And we'll cannibalize them later as necessary. So 2018 was an interesting year. And like we said, we're going to do a 2-part series on this, and we brought up Alchem Layer as a card that we saw where the spike wasn't really real. The floor definitely did raise, and that's kind of where some people expected the reserve list to be at the end of 2018, but we've each identified a card on the reserve list that spiked in 2018, dropped, and we have an expectation for in 2020 based on what we're seeing now. We picked it kind of a couple of weeks ago, so we were a little out ahead on yours, and mine's seen a little bit of traction, but we want to touch on this as we head out and get ready for our next episode. But your card for this is...
So mine that I think is a real spike is Humility.
Bam.
So if you look at 2018, it was sitting at about $16 low, and then we hit a peak of $52 low. Now, about a week, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I said, hey, free bonus pick, Humility. The reserve list is starting to pick up. These cards are starting to spike. This is a very playable card. It's a nightmare for people to deal with because of the rules interactions and layering and everything else. But at the time, it was still sitting at like $20 to $25 low. Well, since then, we've hit 36 low, and we're still climbing a little bit. So this is something that when it happened last time, the floor was raised a little bit, because prior to that, you're seeing it at about $8, $10, and then we're at a $15 to $20 range.
Yep.
So even if this spike doesn't stick, this is an example of where the floor raises, because people buy it up, and you may buy 5 copies and get rid of some of them. But a lot of people only get rid of 4, thinking, well, this card may spike again, and I don't want to have to buy it again if I ever want it. So that's where that is.
Yep.
And that's one that I think is, obviously eminently playable, and I think is very viable as a long-term floor-raising option.
Oh, absolutely. Every now and again, you do see Humility in the sideboard of Legacy decks. And so, speaking of eminent playability, at least in a constructed format, whether or not that wanes out of existence in paper, who knows? There will be stalwarts that keep it around, but that is another avenue for demand, which is always something interesting to keep in the back pocket. My card is similar, and I think it's a little more interesting because it does have a little more history in regards to price movement as the reserve list moves, and it is Feldegriff. Now, Feldegriff has actually seen several spikes in the past couple of years. The earliest one taking it from a $2 card to a $5 card around EMA release. And then in 2018, it went all the way up to $15, but has slowly come back down to about a $6 or $7 card, and now it's on the way back up. And I didn't quite understand why it never picked up ever, because this is a fairly popular general in EDH. It is the pillow fort commander. It was the first one,
Yeah.
I don't know if it's still the most popular with Tristanis out there, but it is a fairly iconic's an odd word to use about this card, but it really is.
It is, yeah.
It is
for
fairly,
older players.
Yeah. And there's questing Feldegriff from Plane Chase. No, Shift. The spirally
Plane
one
Shift.
from Invasion.
Yeah.
From Invasion Block, right? So they reference it every decade and a half. And what I found, yeah, and what I found interesting was as everything else on the reserve list was going up, and at this incredible slope, Feldegriff was just kind of lagging behind. And all of a sudden, it popped up on stocks one day, and I was like, "There's no way this card has an actual value." And the reason I picked it is because it didn't. There was a little bit of manipulation that eventually moved people into buy it. So right now we can see the market's $10 and the average is $14.75 for this card. Well, when you actually jump over to TCG Player and you filter for LP and near mint, you can buy a fairly large number of copies for below what's being reported as the market and the average. So to kind of get this card moving, we saw a little bit of manipulation happen first, and now people are moving into it. And I think this might be the time that this card actually just goes and stays gone in regards to price. If we hit $15 in the next couple of weeks, I wouldn't be surprised. I doubt this card goes for much more than 20, 25 in the long run because there are other Pillow Fort Generals to move in on. It's kind of unique at what it does in the fact that it like gives your opponents everything. They get tokens, they gain life, etc. It's just this kind of niche thing. And when you flop down a Feldegriff, people know you're going to be slow and steady, but you're going to give a lot to the table, so people don't politic you too much until you get to the mid and end game. Yeah, when you can pick up speed. But I think
it's a dumb strategy. Don't do it. You're good at coming in second. You're supposed to win.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Unless you're playing for points, and then at which point a consistent second is fine. You're not spiky. Yeah. But I think this is just the time it goes, and like I said, it doesn't come back because we are narrowing very quickly on the number of LP and near mint copies that exist in the open market. And when you free it up, there are only 24 non-LP or near mint copies of this card left on TCG Player, and the majority of them are MP. So in time, this card is going to become difficult to find at LP or better. And there's a chance that if people start slabbing this card in the near future, that's also going to raise the price on. But it's going to put more pressure on LP and near mint that jump into the market because they will be bought out for the opportunity to be bought and slabbed for whatever price increase comes with it. So that's that. We also had a bit of a conversation that we wanted to talk about cards that are currently spiking and we think are going to fall like they did in 2018. What's your goofy one?
So
smile.
I say this as someone who just made a shit ton of money on this card. Grim Feast. This card's not real. It's fake. It's a meme. It does a unique thing that other cards do better, more efficiently, etc. In 2018, it spiked from a low of like a quarter all the way to $2.50, around $3, somewhere in there. At this point, I was picking up every copy I could that player or shops had listed at $4 or more for less than $1. I was picking them up on Cardsphere. I was doing all kinds of stuff. And then eventually it hit $3, and I was like, oh, well, that's neat. And then you saw it sank right back down to where it was, about 50 cents. Well, last week it hit a low of $10. Come on, people.
Yeah.
No, this card's bad. This card is bad. And so I sold a bunch for $5 each, and sold them all.
Yeah, why not?
There's a tweet about it. This is a card that is not playable. I'm playable. Sure, someone can play it, and people will, but it's not a playable card. In the vein of like a Yawgmoth's Will or a Doran or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So this is how I'm thinking about like this card. This isn't real. The spike isn't going to stick. It may go up to 75 cents after all is said and done. Stay away. This is a FOMO card. When we talk about FOMO, this is where it happens. It happens after the real cards spike. When the real cards that are appropriate to increase in price because supply is dwindling and player demand is increasing, you see stuff like Grim Feast. It's not real. Don't do it.
Nope. Mine is similar, but it's a large grouping of cards, and it is all the terrible legends from Legends. Now, not all of them have increased in price. Things like Stang, I'll bring up in a moment, has not really saw an uptick, but something like Jacques Lever has. Jacques Lever is a 3/2 for 1 and a Nea, and it gives all of your green creatures +0/+2. Outstanding. Outstanding. And you can see on the price graph, it spiked in 2016, it spiked in 2018. It didn't come tumbling back down, but it fell hard from a high of almost $30, and we're creeping back up that way. Not a card. This is not a card I expect to stick around, nor any of the rest of them. The moment Stang and some of the other legends go that have almost no relevant text to them, that's when you know we're basically at the dregs of the reserve list, and you can expect within a couple of months for things to come back down. There's a lot of text on Stang. If you can't read it, I'm sorry about that. It's a 3/4 for 4, a green, and a red. That makes another copy of Stang that is non-legendary, essentially. It's another 3/4 token, and if Stang proper leaves play, the token goes as well. That's it. That's all Stang does.
The best part about this is it was just printed in Masters 25 because it's not reserve list, but you still see it spike when this stuff happens.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's one of those, like, tertiary spikes that, oh, well, there's a bunch of cards in Legends spiking. They must be spiking because they're in Legends.
Yes.
Rather than they're spiking because they're reserve list. Cue FOMO. Here we are.
It's not Dak on a Blackbait. There's a Boris Devil Boon is another good example.
The first card I ever ordered from a non-LGS, I ordered from a Scry magazine. Yep. I called them up and ordered it.
Yep. So we can put Boris up there alongside Jacques Lever.
This card is so bad.
3 black-red for a 2/2 with an ability that says 2 black-red, put a minor demon token into play. Treat this token as a 1/1 red and black creature. You read that right. 7 mana for 3 power and 3 toughness. And we're currently
all-time
creeping
high
over
price, July 27th, 2018.
Yep. It's down here, just a little below the fold if you didn't see it before. Neither Jacques, nor Boris, nor the other legends, reprinted or not, that are or will be spiking, that effectively do nothing or are just insanely overpriced, are cards that we expect to be, quote-unquote, live after this 2020 spike. They will effectively represent the floor of what's going on. And at the end of the day, I think that's kind of the expectation that we really have about this. The summation that we have about what's going on in 2020 is that it's going to mirror 2018. And to give a little more insight into that, we're going to cover that in our next episode, which will be coming out next week. That's where you'll actually get the full set of picks, and once that episode goes up, we'll make a playlist on YouTube, so you can just, back-to-back them if you want.
Back-to-back, yeah.
And then this will basically live in our playlist forever next to all of our other reserve list episodes, because it requires more than one episode to talk about the reserve list and more than 120 or 240 characters to do so as well. So until then, we are excuse me, at MtG Cabal Cast on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Patreon, Stitcher, Spotify,
Apple Podcast.
Yep, Apple Podcast. There you go.
I don't do Apple, so.
Oh, Apple Podcast. Other than that, I am at Halt I Am Reptar on Twitter, and you can be found
at Thirsty Sizzler.
And we'll see you guys next week.